Blood on the snow always looks black in the moonlight. I learned that the night the Alpha King left me to die. He looked down from his war horse, eyes cold as hammered iron, and sneered, "She's too weak, leave her for the scavengers." He thought I was a broken thing, a wolfless runt meant to freeze in the mud. He was wrong, because when the screaming started and his unstoppable pack began to fall, something ancient woke up inside me. Winter in Iron Ridge was not a season. It was a slow, grinding execution. The cold didn't just chill your skin. It burrowed into your joints and stayed there, an uninvited guest gnawing at your bones. I sat on an overturned bucket in the shadow of the skinning sheds, scraping the last stubborn strips of fat from a stiff deer hide. My fingers were raw, the skin split and bleeding into the freezing slush at my feet. I didn't stop. In this pack, if you weren't useful, you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat, the winter took you. I blew on my hands, a pathetic puff of white vapor that vanished instantly. My name was Harley. To the rest of the pack, I was just the blank. 20 years old and still no wolf. In our world, a late bloomer was a tragedy. A blank was a liability. The warning horn blew from the watchtower. It wasn't the frantic, stuttering blast of a rogue attack. It was a single, long, low moan of a ram's horn that rattled the loose timbers of the shed. The Alpha King had arrived. I didn't look up. Let the rest of the village scramble. Let Orson, our local pack leader, puff out his chest and pretend this miserable collection of rotting cabins and starving wolves was a proud frontier outpost. Kings didn't care about outposts. They cared about tribute, meat, furs, and bodies for the border wars. The ground shuddered. A procession of massive armor-clad riders entered the village square. They didn't wear the gleaming steel of fairy tales. Their armor was scarred leather and heavy, dark iron, dented from years of brutal campaigns. At the center rode King Garrick. He was a mountain of a man. His face looked like it had been carved from a cliffside with a dull hatchet, harsh angles, a jaw shadowed by thick stubble, and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. He didn't ride his mount so much as he anchored it. He radiated an aura of command so heavy it made the air feel thin. Orson was already bowing, practically scraping his forehead in the mud. "My king, Iron Ridge welcomes you. We have prepared—" "Save the pleasantries, Orson," Garrick's voice rumbled. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the howling wind effortlessly. "I'm not here for your hospitality. The southern fronts are bleeding. I need fresh fighters. Line up your young." Panic rippled through the square. Mothers tightened their grips on their children. But nobody disobeyed. The king's vanguard dismounted, their heavy boots sloshing in the muck, and began herding anyone of age toward the center of the village. A heavy hand clamped onto my shoulder. Cedric, one of Orson's enforcers, yanked me up from my bucket. "Get in line, blank," he growled. "He wants fighters," I rasped, my throat dry. "I don't have a wolf. I'm useless to him." "You're a body. Let the king decide." He shoved me forward. I stumbled over a frozen rut, catching myself on my bloody palms before I hit the dirt. I swallowed the pain and took my place at the very end of the ragged line of youths. King Garrick walked the line. He didn't ask names. He didn't care about lineages. He was inspecting livestock. He prodded a boy's shoulder, felt the density of a girl's jawline, inhaled their scents to gauge the strength of their inner wolves. "Take him," he'd say. Or, "Too soft. Leave him." He moved closer. I kept my eyes fixed on the mud-spattered toes of my boots. I could smell him before he reached me, a scent of pine, ozone, and old, dried blood. It made my stomach tighten. It was the scent of an apex predator. He stopped in front of me. For a long second, there was only the sound of the wind whipping through the skeletal trees. Then, a heavy, leather-gloved hand caught my chin, and snapped my head up. I forced myself to meet his gaze. His eyes were devoid of anything resembling warmth. He looked at the hollows of my cheeks, the bruised purple bags under my eyes, the violent trembling of my thin frame beneath my frayed cloak. He leaned in, taking a slow breath through his nose, his brow furrowed in disgust. "What is this?" he asked, not looking away from me. Orson scurried forward, wringing his hands. "An anomaly, my king. Harley. She hasn't shifted. She's wolfless." Garrick's thumb traced the line of my jaw. Not with tenderness, but testing the structural integrity of my bones. I felt a humiliating flush of heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my face blank. Let him look. Let him see the nothing I was. He let go of my face, as if he had touched something diseased. He wiped his leather glove on his thigh. "She's too weak," Garrick sneered. The words weren't thrown with malice. They were delivered with absolute, crushing indifference. That was worse. "She smells like rot and dead leaves. She won't survive the march, let alone the war. Why are you wasting winter rations on a corpse, Orson?" She cleans the hides, sire." "Put her on the outer perimeter," Garrick ordered, turning his broad back to me. "If the rogues come, she can at least serve as an early warning scream. Take the rest." Just like that, my life was traded for a few extra pounds of dried meat. The outer perimeter wasn't a defense. It was a bait line. You sat out in the dark, miles from the warmth of the central fires, waiting for something hungry to find you first. I didn't cry. Crying wasted water. I just picked up my rusted skinning knife, pulled my thin cloak tighter, and walked toward the tree line. If I was going to die in the snow, I would at least do it quietly. 3 days later, the King's vanguard was still in Iron Ridge, bogged down by a blizzard that turned the sky to bruised purple and the ground to iron. I was stationed at the northern palisade, a laughable barricade of sharpened logs rotting at the base. My watchtower was a wooden platform that swayed violently with every gust of wind. The cold had moved past pain and settled into a deep, vibrating numbness. I couldn't feel my toes anymore. I vaguely wondered if they would snap off when I took my boots off, assuming I ever did. Below me, the village was quiet. The vanguard had commandeered the sturdiest cabins. Smoke plumed from their chimneys, thick and mocking. I chewed on a piece of frozen hardtack, tasting only ash and the metallic tang of my own bleeding gums. Pack loyalty. The great, sacred bond. What a beautifully packaged lie. The pack didn't protect you. The pack consumed you. You were only as valuable as the violence you could inflict or the pups you could whelp. I was a broken cog in a warmongering machine, and they had finally tossed me out into the snow. The wind shifted. I stopped chewing. A scent rode in on the gale. It wasn't the crisp, clean smell of pine, nor the wood smoke of the village. It was thick, oily, and foul. It smelled like a mass grave left open to the summer sun. I stood up, my frozen joints popping like dry twigs. I peered into the wall of swirling white snow. Nothing. Just the howl of the wind. Then a shadow moved. It didn't step. It slithered, low to the ground. Then another. And another. Dozens of them, pale and emaciated, moving with a twitchy, frenzied speed that defied the deep snow. The scourge. They weren't just rogue wolves. They were a plague. Packs driven mad by a blood sickness from the northern wastelands, cannibalistic and completely devoid of the self-preservation instinct. I grabbed the frozen rope of the warning bell. I pulled with all my pathetic weight. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was dull and flat, swallowed by the storm, but it was enough. Before the bell stopped swinging, the palisade beneath me exploded. Wood splintered into shrapnel. A massive, diseased wolf, half its fur missing, its skin weeping black fluid, hurled itself up the support beams. It didn't climb. It scrambled in a frenzy of snapping teeth and broken claws. I threw myself backward as the platform gave way. I hit the frozen ground of the village hard, the breath tearing from my lungs. Pain flared white-hot in my ribs, but adrenaline, raw and primal, dragged me to my feet. Iron Ridge erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the night, instantly drowned out by the guttural, wet snarling of the scourge. They poured over the broken palisade like a wave of rotting meat. Cabins were breached in seconds. The vanguard emerged. To their credit, they didn't hesitate. Men and women threw themselves into the snow, shifting mid-air. Massive wolves, timber-brown, charcoal, and slate-grey, collided with the diseased invaders. I didn't fight. I wasn't stupid. I grabbed a fallen torch from the mud and ran toward the skinning sheds. The village children, the elders, the injured. They were hidden in the root cellar beneath the main meat house. I dodged a massive melee in the square. Garrick was there. He had shifted. His wolf was a monstrous thing, black as pitch and heavily muscled, standing a full head taller than his elites. He fought with brutal, mechanical efficiency. A scourge wolf leaped at his throat. He caught it mid-air, snapping its spine with a sickening crunch before tossing it aside. But there were too many. For every one he killed, 3 more swarmed over the palisade. The scourge didn't feel pain. They fought with their entrails dragging in the snow, snapping their teeth until their jaws were pulverized. Fire broke out. A shattered lantern caught the thatch of the longhouse. Orange flames licked the night sky, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the slaughter. The snow turned to red slush. I reached the meat house. The heavy wooden doors were barred from the inside. I pounded on the wood with the hilt of my knife. "Hilda, it's Harley. Let me in." No answer. Just the muffled sounds of crying from beneath the floorboards. They were terrified. They wouldn't open the door. I turned, backing up against the heavy timber, holding my useless rusted knife in front of me. The battle in the square was turning. The vanguard was forming a defensive circle around the king, but they were being pushed back. Garrick was bleeding, a deep, ragged tear across his flank slowing his movements. A shadow detached itself from the burning longhouse. It was a Scourge Alpha. It was terrifying, a nightmare of exposed bone and stringy, infected muscle. Its eyes were milky white, blind with sickness, but its nose pointed straight at the meat house, straight at the heavy scent of children hiding underneath. Straight at me, I looked toward the square. Garrick saw it. He saw the beast locking onto the cellar. For a fraction of a second, the Alpha King's dark eyes met mine across the burning courtyard. He lunged to break through the circle of his attackers to intercept it, but 4 scourge wolves piled onto him, burying him in a mass of snapping teeth and rotting fur. He couldn't save us. He wouldn't save us. The diseased Alpha took a slow, deliberate step toward me. It let out a sound that wasn't a growl but a wet, rattling wheeze. Drool, thick with black blood, pattered into the snow. I gripped my rusted knife. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold it. I was going to die here, pinned against a door by a rotting monster, because a king told me I was too weak to live. No. The thought wasn't a whisper. It was a roar in my mind. I was sick of the cold. I was sick of the hunger. I was sick of bowing to arrogant wolves who measured worth in muscle and cruelty. The beast lunged. It didn't happen like the old songs claimed. There was no ethereal light, no sudden rush of majestic peace. It felt like dying. As the Scourge Alpha left the ground, jaws gaping wide to snap my neck, a heat unlike anything I had ever felt exploded in my chest. It wasn't the warmth of a fire. It was the molten core of a volcano detonating inside my veins. My vision washed out in a blinding, terrifying white. The rusted knife slipped from my fingers. I screamed, but the sound tore my vocal cords to shreds. My spine arched so violently, I heard the vertebrae crack. It didn't just hurt, it was agony. My skin felt too tight, stretching, ripping at the seams to make way for something massive that was clawing its way out from beneath my ribs. I hit the snow, thrashing, my bones elongating, snapping, and resetting in a brutal, rapid-fire sequence of biological violence. The Scourge Alpha landed on top of me. Its rotting jaws snapped shut on my shoulder. It should have torn my arm off. Instead, its teeth shattered. The Alpha recoiled, whining in confusion. I opened my eyes. The world was different. The dull, dark night was suddenly illuminated in razor-sharp, crystalline clarity. I could see the individual flakes of ash falling from the burning longhouse. I could hear the frantic, panicked heartbeats of the children beneath the floorboards. I could smell the rot of the beast in front of me, down to the molecular level of its decay. I wasn't looking up at it anymore. I was looking down at it. I pushed myself off the ground. The movement was alien, yet perfectly instinctual. Heavy paws slammed into the red mud. I shook my head, and a violent shudder rippled down my spine. I looked at my forelegs. They were massive, thicker than tree trunks, and they weren't brown or black or grey. They were silver. Not the dull grey of an aging wolf, but a blinding, metallic, incandescent silver that caught the firelight and threw it back. It was a colour that hadn't been seen in our world for centuries. The colour of the first pack, the colour of legends whispered by crackling hearths, the apex lineage thought dead long before Garrick's bloodline ever claimed a throne. The Scourge Alpha realized its mistake. It didn't attack. It tried to run. I didn't let it. The speed at which I moved was terrifying. I was a blur of pale violence. I hit the rotting beast broadside, the impact sounding like a boulder striking a castle door. The Alpha was thrown through the air, crashing through the remains of the watchtower. It tried to stand. I was already there. I didn't bite its neck. I slammed a massive silver paw onto its chest, pinning it to the frozen earth. I felt its ribs cave in under my weight. I looked down into its milky, terrified eyes, curled my lip to expose fangs the size of daggers, and crushed its skull with a single, brutal stomp. Silence rippled outward from my kill. In the square, the battle faltered. The vanguard froze. Even the mindless Scourge wolves stopped their frenzied attacks, their diseased brains registering a sudden, overwhelming shift in the atmosphere. The scent of a true apex predator had saturated the air. It was a scent that commanded absolute, unquestioning submission. I turned toward the square. My blood was singing. The cold was gone. The weakness, the hunger, the years of quiet, scraping humiliation, burned away in the furnace of my new form. I let out a howl. It wasn't a call for help. It was an eviction notice. The sound was so deep, so resonant, that it rattled the glass in the remaining windows and caused the flames of the burning longhouse to physically lean away. I charged. I hit the flank of the Scourge pack like a silver battering ram. I didn't fight with the trained, militaristic tactics of Garrick's vanguard. I fought with pure, unadulterated, primal rage. I tore through their ranks, severing limbs and snapping spines with terrifying ease. They were nothing. They were rotting leaves before a hurricane. A cluster of Scourge had King Garrick pinned against the stone base of the well. His black wolf was bleeding heavily, exhaustion finally taking its toll. He was snapping wildly, but they were dragging him down by his hind legs. I cleared the distance in 3 massive bounds. I grabbed the largest of his attackers by the scruff of its neck, lifted it entirely off the ground, and whipped my head to the side. The beast's neck snapped with a loud crack, and I tossed it into the fire. I stepped over Garrick's prone form, placing myself between the Alpha King and the remaining horde. I didn't roar, I just stared at them, my silver fur bristling, blood dripping from my jaws. The survival instinct of the diseased wolves finally overrode their madness. They broke. The few that were left turned and fled blindly into the storm, abandoning the village, abandoning their dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. The only sounds were the crackle of burning thatch and the ragged breathing of the survivors. I stood in the center of the carnage. The silver fur of my chest was stained with the black blood of the enemy, but I didn't feel a single wound. I felt invincible. Slowly behind me, I heard the sound of shifting bone and tearing flesh. I turned. Garrick had shifted back to his human form. He was naked, covered in blood and mud, leaning heavily against the stone well. He was panting, clutching a vicious tear in his side. He looked at me. His arrogant, bruised sky eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in absolute, unmasked shock. He was staring at a myth made flesh. He was staring at the silver beast that had just annihilated a force that nearly destroyed his elite guard. I didn't shift back. I didn't want to be the freezing, starving girl in the mud anymore. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. My head was level with his chest. I lowered my muzzle to within an inch of his face. I could smell his fear, sharp and acrid, cutting through the scent of his blood. He held his breath. He knew, in that exact second, that if I closed my jaws around his throat, no one in this village would be fast enough, or brave enough, to stop me. I let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated against his chest. I didn't bow. I didn't avert my gaze. "She's too weak," he had said. I huffed a breath of hot air directly into his face, turned my back on the Alpha King, and walked away into the snow. The forest swallowed me whole. Away from the burning village, the woods were a cathedral of black pine and crushing silence. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that the sheer, explosive power in my limbs demanded to be used. I vaulted over fallen logs that would have taken me minutes to climb as a human. I tore through thickets of thorns that shattered against my silver coat like brittle glass. I was a ghost, a 400-pound engine of muscle and fury moving silently over the deep powder. Eventually, the adrenaline began to curdle. The furnace in my chest cooled to a manageable burn. I slowed to a trot, then a walk, my massive paws sinking into the snow. The silence of the deep woods pressed in on me, and with it, reality. I couldn't stay a wolf forever. The shift back was less violent than the awakening, but it was still an ugly, agonizing process. I collapsed near the base of a hollowed-out oak. The silver fur receded, sinking back into my pores like melting frost. My bones cracked and shortened, my jaw unhinged and snapped back into its blunt, human shape. I hit the frozen dirt naked, gasping for air. The cold hit me immediately, but it didn't slice through my marrow like it used to. My human skin was flushed, radiating a faint, residual heat. I pushed myself up. My muscles ached, a deep, resonant soreness, like I had carried a boulder up a mountain. But the chronic, hollow ache of starvation was gone. I felt dense, grounded. I needed clothes. A mile back, I had caught the scent of an old trapper's lean-to. I backtracked, moving through the dark with a newfound ease. My human eyes were sharper now. The night was painted in muted shades of blue and grey, rather than impenetrable black. I found the shelter. It was half-collapsed, smelling faintly of ancient wood smoke and dried blood. Inside, buried under a pile of rotting burlap, I found a stiff, oversized wool tunic and a heavy, moth-eaten bearskin cloak. I pulled them on. The wool was scratchy and smelled like mildew, but it was armor against the wind. I sat in the dark, pulling my knees to my chest. A silver. I had heard the elders' stories. The silver wolves weren't just rare. They were a biological myth, the genetic ancestors of all packs. They didn't bow to alphas. They broke alphas. And I, the ragged blank of Ironridge, was one of them. A twig snapped. It was a tiny sound, muffled by the snow, but to my new ears it sounded like a gunshot. I didn't panic. I just breathed in through my nose. The scent hit the back of my throat. Pine, ozone, and fresh, wet copper. He was bleeding heavily. I stepped out of the lean-to. King Garrick stood 20 yards away. He was alone. He hadn't bothered to dress fully. He wore dark leather trousers and heavy boots, his broad, scarred chest bare to the freezing wind. A thick bandage was wrapped tightly around his midsection, already blossoming with a dark red stain. He held a massive broadsword resting casually over his shoulder, but his grip was white-knuckled. He didn't look like a king right now. He looked like a weary, wounded predator, tracking a threat he didn't fully understand. "You're tracking me," I said. My voice was different, deeper, smoother. The rasp of the cold was gone. Garrick stopped. His dark, bruised sky eyes locked onto mine. He looked at the oversized tunic, the frayed cloak, the messy tangle of my dark hair. He was searching for the silver beast, trying to reconcile that monster with the scrawny girl he had condemned to die a few hours ago. "You walk quietly for a heavy man," I added. "You left a trail," he rumbled. His voice was tight with pain. "A blind man could follow the crushed brush. You don't know how to hide your weight yet." I wasn't trying to hide. I stood my ground. Before tonight, I would have dropped my gaze. I would have folded my arms and made myself as small as possible. Now, I met his stare directly. I felt the pulse in my neck steady. The dormant wolf beneath my skin stirred, a low, thrumming vibration of warning. "You killed the Scourge Alpha," Garrick said, lowering the broadsword so the tip rested in the snow. "You broke a siege that would have slaughtered my vanguard. You saved my life." "I saved myself," I corrected coldly. "You were just in the way." Garrick let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh, wincing as the movement pulled at his torn side. "Honest. I like that. I don't care what you like." I crossed my arms, the heavy bare skin settling over my shoulders. "You told Orson I was too weak. You told him to leave me on the perimeter as bait. Why are you here, King? Did you come to finish the job?" He didn't flinch at the accusation. He didn't offer a groveling apology. He was a wartime ruler. He dealt in grim mathematics. "I made a tactical error," Garrick said flatly. "I judged you by the meat on your bones and the absence of a scent. I was wrong. You're a silver." He stepped closer. The sheer size of him was intimidating, but I refused to step back. "Do you have any idea what that means?" "It means I don't have to scrape fat off deer hides anymore. It means," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravel, "that you are the most valuable weapon on this continent, and every warlord between here and the northern wastes is going to want your head on a pike or a collar around your neck." The wind howled through the skeletal branches, whipping the snow into a localized frenzy between us. "A weapon," I repeated, tasting the bitter iron of the word. "Is that all anyone is to you? Meat for the grinder, weapons for your wars." "Yes," Garrick said without a shred of hesitation. "When the alternative is extinction, yes. Everyone serves a purpose. Today, yours was surviving." He swayed slightly. The blood seeping through his bandages was freezing into dark, jagged icicles against his skin. He was losing strength, but his eyes never left mine. They were calculating. "I don't serve you," I told him. "I don't owe you, or Orson, or Ironridge a damn thing. This pack let me starve. They let me freeze. They treated me like a disease because I didn't shift on their schedule." "They treated you like a liability because that's what you appeared to be," Garrick replied, his tone devoid of pity. "Nature doesn't care about your feelings, Harley. The weak die, The strong survive. That is the only law that matters. And who decides who's weak? I shot back, taking a step toward him. You? Sitting on a horse, pointing a finger. You were on your back in the mud tonight, Garrick. If I hadn't stepped in, the scourge would be picking your bones clean. So who's the weak one now? The air between us snapped with sudden, violent tension. No one spoke to the Alpha King like that. A normal wolf would have been forced to their knees by the sheer, crushing pressure of his aura. He projected dominance like a physical weight. But I didn't feel it. Or rather, my wolf didn't care. The silver beast inside me rose to meet it, pushing back with an aura of absolute, ancient defiance. Garrick's jaw tightened. For a second, I saw the urge to violence flash in his eyes, but he was too smart for that. He was bleeding out in the snow, and he knew he couldn't take me in a fight. Not tonight. Point taken, he rasped, leaning heavier on his sword. You have the power, but you have no control. You're a child holding a loaded cannon. You don't know how to fight in a pack. You don't know how to survive the politics of the capital. And you don't know what caused the scourge. That made me pause. A sickness from the wastelands. A manufactured sickness, Garrick corrected, his breathing growing shallower. The Ravagers in the north. A warlord named Julian is infecting rogue packs and driving them south to test our borders. Tonight was just a scouting party. Next month, it will be an army. He took another step, closing the distance until I could feel the heat radiating off his massive chest. You can stay here, Garrick said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You can kill Orson, take over this miserable, rotting outpost, and rule over the ashes. You can be the queen of the dirt. Or you can come with me. Why would I go with the man who ordered my death? Because I can train you. Because my vanguard has the resources to feed that monster inside you. And because if you don't help me stop Julian, the Ravagers will eventually sweep through this forest, and not even a silver wolf can fight an army of 10,000 alone. He wasn't begging. He was offering a transaction. My power for his resources, my fury directed at his enemies. I looked at his bleeding side. He was swaying worse now. His knuckles on the hilt of the sword were trembling. You're dying right now, I pointed out. A temporary inconvenience, he grunted stubbornly. I let out a slow breath. He was an arrogant, ruthless bastard. But he was right. I knew nothing about being a wolf, let alone a silver. If I stayed in the woods, I'd eventually be hunted down by someone with better numbers and better tactics. Fine, I said. I go with you, but on my terms. Garrick raised a dark eyebrow. You're in no position to dictate terms to a king. I just watched you get dragged through the mud by walking corpses. I think I am. I leveled a glare at him. I don't bow to you. I don't take orders from your captains. I am not a conscript. I'm an independent contractor. You feed me, you clothe me, and you point me at the Ravagers. But I answer only to myself. Garrick stared at me for a long, silent moment. The wind whipped his dark hair across his face. Slowly, a grim, blood-stained smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. Deal, he whispered. His eyes rolled back in his head, and the Alpha King collapsed face first into the snow. The march south was a miserable affair. We strapped Garrick to a makeshift travois, dragged by two of his largest vanguard elites. The king was unconscious for 3 days, burning with a fever from the infected scourge bites. I didn't help pull. I walked at the back of the column. The vanguard numbered about 50. They were hardened veterans, their leather armor scarred, their faces carved from stone. They didn't speak to me. They communicated in sharp hand signals and low, guttural growls. To them, I was an anomaly. Orson had told them what I did, but they hadn't seen it. They had only seen the aftermath. Now looking at the pale, skinny girl trudging through the snow in a stolen, oversized tunic, they clearly thought Orson had lost his mind. The hostility was palpable. I could smell their skepticism. It smelled like sour sweat and ozone. We reached the central staging camp at dusk on the 4th day. It was a massive, sprawling encampment of heavy canvas tents and roaring fire pits, nestled in a valley protected by sheer granite cliffs. This wasn't a village. It was a war machine. Hundreds of wolves moved with militaristic precision. The smell of roasting meat and forging iron was overwhelming. As we entered the camp, the whispers started. "The king is down. Who is the girl? Look at the state of her. A scavenger?" A massive man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his collarbone stepped out from the command tent. He wore heavy steel pauldrons over his furs. He took one look at the travois and snarled. "Get the healers, now!" he roared. He turned to the 2 elites pulling Garrick. "What happened? Where is the rest of the scouting party?" "Scourge ambush at Iron Ridge, Captain Conrad," one of the elites reported, panting. "Heavy losses. The king took a hit defending the square." Conrad's eyes flicked to me. He looked me up and down, his lip curling in disgust. "And why did you bring trash back with you? We don't have rations for strays." She's not a stray, sir," the elite hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "She's the one who broke the siege." Conrad let out a harsh laugh. "Her? She looks like a stiff breeze would snap her in half." He stepped toward me, towering over my frame. He projected his aura, a heavy, suffocating wave of dominant alpha energy meant to force submissives to drop their gaze and bare their necks. I didn't blink. I felt the pressure against my skin, but it was like a gentle breeze against a brick wall. My wolf didn't even bother to growl. It just sat up in my mind, immensely bored by the display. Conrad frowned. He stepped closer, invading my space. "I don't know what kind of trick you played up north, girl, but in this camp, you bow when an officer looks at you." He reached out to grab the scruff of my stolen cloak. He didn't make contact. I didn't fully shift. I didn't need to. I just let the leash slip an inch. My eyes flashed from their normal dull brown to a blinding metallic silver. A low, vibrating hum emanated from my chest. Not a sound, but a physical shockwave that rippled through the air. The temperature around us instantly plummeted. Conrad slammed into an invisible wall. His eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure, instinctual terror. His wolf, a battle-hardened alpha, recognized the signature of a true apex predator and instantly submitted. Conrad's knees buckled. He hit the frozen mud hard, gasping for air as if the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. The entire camp went dead silent. Dozens of elite warriors stopped mid-stride. Blacksmiths froze at their anvils. Every pair of eyes was locked on me, wide with shock. I let the silver fade from my eyes and pulled the leash taut again. The crushing pressure in the air vanished. "I don't bow," I said to Conrad, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the silent camp. "And if you ever reach for me again, you'll pull back a stump. Am I understood, Captain?" Conrad, pale and shaking, could only manage a jerky nod from the mud. I stepped over him and walked toward the largest fire pit. A thick haunch of venison was roasting on a spit. I drew the rusted skinning knife I still carried, carved off a massive, dripping chunk of meat, and sat down on a nearby log. I ignored the hundreds of staring eyes. I ignored the whispers that were rapidly changing from mockery to terrified awe. I took a bite of the hot meat, closing my eyes as the rich flavor exploded over my tongue. Garrick wanted a weapon. He had one. But I was going to make sure they knew exactly whose hand held the hilt. Garrick was unconscious for 8 days. In that time, I became the camp ghost. I didn't train with the vanguard. I didn't eat in the mess tents. I slept on a pile of raw sheepskins near the armory. curled around the lingering heat of the forging fires. The soldiers gave me a wide berth. They looked at me the way you look at an unexploded bomb sitting in the middle of your living room. They didn't understand the silver eyes. They didn't understand how a girl who weighed less than a sack of grain could drop their most decorated captain without throwing a punch. Fear was a strange cloak to wear. It was heavy, isolating, but undeniably warm. No one asked me to scrape hides. No one checked my rations. On the 9th day, the king walked out of the medical tent. He looked thinner, the heavy muscle of his chest carved out by the fever. A fresh, angry, pink scar slashed across his ribs. But his posture was unchanged. He didn't lean on anything. He walked with the slow, deliberate stride of a predator returning to its territory. He found me behind the fletching sheds, throwing my rusted knife at a rotting pine stump. I was terrible at it. The blade kept bouncing off the bark, clattering into the snow. "Your grip is too tight," Garrick said. I didn't turn around. I picked up the knife, wiped the snow from the blade, and threw it again. It bounced. "You're choking the hilt," he continued, stepping up beside me. He smelled like bitter herbs and clean sweat. "You think strength comes from the squeeze. It comes from the snap of the wrist. The knife needs to leave your hand freely, not escape it." I looked at him. "Shouldn't you be in bed, Your Majesty?" "I heard you broke Captain Conrad's pride," he replied, ignoring my question. "He submitted his resignation this morning, said he refuses to serve in a camp where a stray dictates the hierarchy." "Are you going to ask me to apologize?" Garrick snorted. It was a rough, scraping sound. "I rejected his resignation and told him to stop whining. If he can't handle a display of dominance from a superior predator, he has no business commanding my flanks. But—" He stepped closer, reaching out to pluck the knife from my hand. He didn't ask. He just took it. "We need to talk about that power of yours." He flipped the knife casually by the blade, then threw it. It buried itself to the hilt in the dead center of the pine stump with a loud thwack. "You're a silver," Garrick said, turning to face me. "You have the raw output of a god. But you have zero finesse. You project dominance like a child throwing a tantrum. In a real war, against Julian's ravagers, brute force will only get you so far. They will tire you out, surround you, and bleed you dry. You need to learn how to fight as a human, and you need to learn how to leash the beast until the exact moment you need it." "So train me," I challenged, crossing my arms. "Take off your cloak." I blinked. "What?" "Take off the bearskin. It's weighing you down. If you want to learn how to fight, we start now. And we start in the skin you're in." The wind was biting, slicing through the camp with casual cruelty. But I didn't argue. I unclasped the heavy fur and let it drop to the snow. I stood in the oversized, scratchy wool tunic, my bare legs already breaking out in goosebumps. Garrick didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. His hand clamped around my throat. He didn't squeeze. He didn't cut off my air. But the sheer, shocking force of his momentum drove me backward. I hit the rough wood of the fletching shed hard enough to rattle my teeth. Instinct roared to life. My vision flared white. The heat in my chest detonated, the silver wolf clawing at the surface, ready to shatter my human bones and tear this arrogant man to shreds. "No," Garrick growled, his face inches from mine. His bruised sky eyes were blazing. "Hold it back." I grabbed his wrist with both hands. I tried to pry his fingers away, but his grip was like cast iron. "You're panicking," he said calmly, despite pinning me to a wall. "You feel threatened, so you default to the monster. But the monster takes a toll. Every time you shift, you burn through thousands of calories. You tear your human muscles. If you shift every time someone grabs you, you'll be dead of exhaustion before we even reach the battlefield." Let go. I ground out through clenched teeth. My skin was burning. I could feel the silver fur trying to push through my pores. Fight me without her, Garrick ordered. Use your human weight. Use leverage. Break the hold. I stopped pulling at his fingers. I forced myself to breathe. The silver wolf snarled in my mind, a violent, thrashing thing, but I visualized a heavy iron door slamming shut over it. I locked the latch. The white-hot heat receded to a dull, manageable burn. I looked at Garrick's stance. His legs were spread, his weight shifted forward. I dropped my center of gravity, ignoring the hand on my throat, and brought my knee up hard into his injured side. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath as pain flared across his face. His grip loosened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was enough. I twisted my upper body violently, bringing my elbow down on his forearm to break the hold, then drove the heel of my hand upward toward his chin. He caught my wrist before the strike landed. We stood there, frozen. I was panting, my chest heaving against the cold air. Garrick was breathing heavily too, holding my wrist a mere inch from his jaw. The anger in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by something entirely different. Something dark, assessing, and dangerously intense. He didn't look at me like I was a weapon anymore. He looked at me like I was a match dropped in a powder keg. Slowly, deliberately, he released my wrist. He stepped back, rubbing his freshly bruised ribs. A grim, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. Better, he rasped. Tomorrow, we start on footwork. Pick up your cloak before you freeze to death. He turned and walked back toward the command tent. I stood shivering against the shed, rubbing my throat. I could still feel the phantom pressure of his fingers against my skin. It didn't feel like violence. It felt like an anchor. For the first time in my miserable, hungry life, someone had pushed me to my absolute limit without trying to break me. Winter didn't yield to the coming of war. It sharpened its teeth. 3 weeks into my training, the scouts returned. There were 5 of them. Only 2 rode into camp. The others were draped over the saddles, their blood frozen into dark ribbons down the flanks of their horses. Finn, a young tracker barely out of his teens, practically fell from his mount. His leather armor was shredded. His face was chalk white, smeared with dirt and dried gore. Garrick caught the boy by the shoulders before he hit the mud. "Report!" the king barked. The camp had instantly gone still. The rhythmic ringing of the blacksmith's hammer stopped. "They're through the pass, sire," Finn choked out, his whole body shaking. "Warlord Julian, it's not a raiding party. It's an extermination force. Hundreds of scourge wolves, acting as shock troops, and behind them—" Finn swallowed hard. "Ravagers, fully armored. They aren't moving like a pack. They're marching like an army." "How far?" Garrick demanded. "Half a day's march. They'll reach the valley ridge by nightfall." Garrick didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He turned to his lieutenants. "Sound the horn. Form up the defensive lines at the valley choke point. Archers on the ridges. Heavy infantry in the center. We hold them in the narrows." The camp exploded into organized chaos. Armor was strapped on. Weapons were honed. Orders were screamed over the howling wind. I stood by the fire pit, watching the war machine grind into motion. Finn sat on a crate nearby, a healer wrapping a weeping gash on his arm. He looked terrified. He looked like I felt every day in Iron Ridge. I walked over to him. I reached into the satchel at my waist and pulled out a small, dried strip of salted beef I had stashed away. I handed it to him. Finn looked up, surprised. He took the meat with a trembling, blood-stained hand. "Thank you, Lady Harley." The title sounded absurd. A month ago, I was the Blank. "Don't call me that," I said quietly. "Are they really that many?" Finn nodded, chewing mechanically. "The snow was black with them. They don't howl. That's the terrifying part. They just march in absolute silence. The warlord, Julian, I saw him. He's massive. He rides a beast that doesn't even look like a wolf anymore. It looks like a nightmare. A heavy hand clapped onto my shoulder. I didn't need to look to know it was Garrick. "Go to the command tent, Finn." "Rest," Garrick said. He turned to me. His armor was fully strapped, black iron plates over heavy, reinforced leather. He looked indestructible. "Walk with me." We walked toward the northern edge of the camp, where the valley narrowed into a jagged gorge. The sky above was a bruised, sullen grey, pregnant with snow. "You are the anvil," Garrick said, staring out at the frozen pass. "The vanguard will hold the line. We will take the brunt of the scourge. We will let them break their teeth on our shields. But when Julian's heavy ravagers hit the field, the line will buckle. That is when I need you." He turned to face me. "I don't need you to fight with honor. I don't need you to follow formations. When the signal horn blows twice, I need you to wade into the center of their army and become the monster. Break their morale, shatter their lines. Can you do that?" I looked up at his harsh, craggy face. I thought about the starving girl in Iron Ridge. I thought about the rotting palisades, the cold mud, the endless, grinding misery of being the weakest thing in a brutal world. These soldiers, Conrad, Orson, the elites, they would have let me die without a second thought. I owed them nothing. But as I looked at the smoke rising from the campfires, at young kids like Finn, trembling, holding swords too heavy for them, the cynicism cracked. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting because behind them lay hundreds of miles of defenseless villages, full of blanks and late bloomers and tired mothers who would be slaughtered if this line fell. "I'll break them," I said quietly. Garrick studied my face. For a fleeting second, the grim mask of the Alpha King slipped. He reached out, his leather-clad fingers tracing the line of my jaw. It was the exact same motion he had made in Iron Ridge, the day he condemned me. But this time, there was no disgust. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, lingering. The touch was startlingly gentle, a stark contrast to the cold iron of his gauntlet. "Survive this," Garrick murmured, his voice dropping to a low, territorial rumble. "That is an order, Harley." "I told you," I whispered back, my heart kicking against my ribs. "I don't take orders." The warning horns blew, a long, mournful blast that echoed off the granite cliffs. The enemy had arrived. Night fell like a guillotine. The vanguard stood in tight, overlapping shield walls across the narrow gorge. I stood on a small rise just behind the main line, a heavy wool cloak wrapped tightly around my shoulders. At first, there was only the wind. Then, the shadows in the gorge began to move. Finn was right. The silence was the worst part. There were no war cries, no drums, just the sickening, wet sound of thousands of paws and boots sloshing through the slush, accompanied by the low, rattling wheezes of the diseased scourge wolves. They hit our lines like a tidal wave of rot. The clash of steel and the shrieks of dying wolves shattered the night. The vanguard held firm, spears thrust from behind heavy oak shields, impaling the rabid beasts. But the scourge didn't care. They climbed over the bodies of their own pack-mates, throwing themselves onto the blades, just to snap their rotting teeth at the faces of our soldiers. The smell was atrocious, a suffocating miasma of decayed flesh, voided bowels, and fresh, hot blood. Garrick was in the center, his massive broadsword moving in wide, devastating arcs. He was a machine of death, severing heads and limbs with terrifying efficiency. But the tide was endless. For 2 hours it was a meat grinder. The white snow of the valley turned a deep, horrific crimson. The vanguard was exhausting itself. Shields were splintering. The line was bowing inward. Then the ground trembled. A deep, rhythmic thudding echoed through the gorge. The mindless scourge suddenly parted, peeling back from the center of the battlefield. Through the mist of blood and breath emerged the Ravagers. They were massive men and women, clad in jagged, rusted plate armor. They didn't shift into wolves. They fought in human form, wielding massive war hammers and axes. And at their center rode Warlord Julian. He was a mountain of scarred flesh, bald and covered in tribal tattoos. He sat atop a beast that defied nature, a mutated, hulking, dire wolf the size of a draft horse, its fur patchy, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural green light. "Garrick!" Julian roared, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Your reign is over. The North claims this land." The Ravagers charged. They hit the exhausted vanguard line like a battering ram. The shield wall shattered. Men were thrown into the air, their armor crumpled by the massive war hammers. Garrick roared, rallying his elites, and dove into the fray, his broadsword clashing violently against Julian's massive iron battle-axe. The king was strong, but he was tired, and his old wound was bleeding again. Julian's dire beast snapped its massive jaws, catching Garrick's sword arm. Garrick grunted, dropping to one knee as Julian raised his axe for the killing blow. Blow the horn, I thought, my pulse hammering in my ears. Blow the damn horn. Two sharp, desperate blasts rang out from the command tent. I didn't take my cloak off. I didn't need to. I closed my eyes and stopped fighting the heavy iron door in my mind. I threw the latch open and let the volcano erupt. The shift was instantaneous. There was no pain this time, only an explosive, euphoric rush of absolute power. My clothes shredded into confetti as my bones expanded. The blinding white heat consumed me, and I hit the snow not as a human, but as a 400-pound engine of silver destruction. I let out a roar. It wasn't a wolf's howl. It sounded like a thunderstorm tearing the sky apart. The sheer sonic force of it flattened the snow in a 50-yard radius. The battlefield froze. Every eye, human and wolf, turned toward the ridge. I didn't run. I launched myself. I cleared the 30 yards between the ridge and the front line in a single, terrifying bound, landing directly in the center of the Ravager formation. A massive Ravager swung a war hammer at my ribs. I didn't dodge. The iron hammer struck my silver fur and shattered with a deafening crack. The man stared at his broken handle in disbelief. I snapped my jaws around his armored torso and bit down. The steel plate folded like wet paper. I tossed him aside like a broken doll. I was a blur of metallic light in the darkness. I didn't fight with tactics. I fought with the ancient, unbridled fury of an apex predator that had been starved of its rightful place in the world. I tore through their heavy infantry, moving faster than their eyes could track. I carved a path of pure carnage straight toward the warlord. Julian's dire beast saw me coming. It let out a guttural shriek and lunged, its massive claws extended. I met it mid-air. The impact sounded like a cannon firing. I was smaller than the mutated beast, but I was vastly denser. I caught the monster by its thick throat. We crashed to the ground, rolling through the bloody snow. The beast thrashed, its green eyes wide with panic, trying to disembowel me with its hind legs. My silver fur turned the blows aside. I pinned it to the earth, dug my claws deep into its chest, and ripped its throat out. The dire beast went limp. I stood over its corpse, chest heaving, silver fur coated in dark blood. I looked up. Warlord Julian was on the ground, having been thrown from his mount. He scrambled backward, his battle-axe forgotten in the snow. The arrogant, booming warlord was gone. In his eyes, I saw the exact same thing I had seen in Captain Conrad's eyes. Pure, primal terror. He looked at my silver coat. He felt the crushing, suffocating weight of my aura. He realized, too late, that he wasn't fighting a king. He was fighting a god. "No," Julian whispered. holding up a trembling hand. "Wait." I didn't wait. I lunged, my jaws clamping precisely over his skull. I didn't crush it. I just held him there, his life literally resting between my teeth. A low, terrifying growl vibrated in my chest, shaking the ground beneath us. I looked up at the remaining ravagers and the horde of scourge wolves. I projected my aura outward. I didn't just push. I slammed it down on the valley like a physical ceiling dropping from the sky. Submit. The command wasn't spoken. It was felt in the marrow of every living thing in that gorge. The effect was instantaneous. The scourge wolves, driven by madness and bloodlust, suddenly stopped whining. They dropped to their bellies, whimpering, pressing their snouts into the bloody snow. The massive, heavily armored ravagers dropped their weapons. Clattering steel echoed through the silent valley as hundreds of men fell to their knees, bowing their heads, unable to look at the blinding silver light of my form. Even the vanguard, Orson's elites, the hardened veterans, young Finn, they all dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in absolute reverence to the Apex lineage. Only one man remained standing. King Garrick. He was covered in blood, clutching his mangled arm, leaning heavily on his broadsword. He looked across the sea of kneeling soldiers and monstrous wolves, his eyes locking onto mine. I released Julian's head. The warlord slumped into the snow, weeping in terror. Completely broken, I shifted back. The silver receded. I stood naked in the freezing wind, coated in the blood of my enemies. I wasn't cold. The furnace inside me burned bright and steady. One of Garrick's lieutenants immediately stripped off his heavy winter cloak and ran forward, throwing it over my shoulders with trembling hands before quickly backing away, his eyes locked on the dirt. I pulled the cloak tight. I walked over the bodies, stepping through the kneeling ranks of the ravagers until I stood in front of the Alpha King. Garrick looked down at me. The arrogant king who had sat on his warhorse and called me weak was gone. He looked at the blood on my face, the unyielding fire in my eyes, and he understood. I was not his weapon. I was not his subject. Slowly, painfully, Garrick took his massive broadsword and drove the tip deep into the frozen earth. He let go of the hilt. He lowered his massive frame, dropping to one knee in the bloody snow right in front of me. He bowed his head, exposing his neck. "My king," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion and absolute loyalty. I reached out, my blood-stained fingers gently catching his chin, mirroring the gesture he had given me in Iron Ridge. I lifted his head until his bruised sky eyes met mine. "Stand up, Garrick," I whispered, the cynicism gone, replaced by something infinitely stronger. "I told you, I don't want anyone bowing to me." He stood, towering over me, a bloody, battered smile breaking across his harsh face. He didn't say a word. He just stepped forward, wrapped his good arm around my waist, and pulled me flush against his chest, burying his face in my hair. The war wasn't over. The North was still a threat. But as I stood in the middle of a conquered army, wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous man on the continent, I knew one thing for certain. The winter of my life was finally over. The reign of the Silver Wolf had begun. If you felt the ground shake when the Silver Wolf roared, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Harley went from starving in the mud to breaking warlords and claiming the heart of the Alpha King. But the North is vast, and new threats are always lurking in the shadows. What did you think of that epic battlefield transformation? Drop a comment below and let me know your favorite moment. Don't forget to share this video with your pack to help us grow. Stay wild, keep your fangs sharp, and I'll see you in the next story.